Chapter 3 of Operation Terror by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Operation Terror, Chapter 3. It was a long descent, made longer by the blindfold and clumsier by his inability to move his arms. More than once Lockley stumbled, twice he fell. The claw-like hands or hand-like claws lifted him and thrust him on the way that was being chosen for him. There were whistling squeaks. Presently he realized that some of them were directed at him. A squeak or whistle in a warning tone told him that he must be especially careful just here. He came to accept the warnings. It occurred to him that the squeaks sounded very much like those button-shaped hollow whistles that children put in their mouths to make strident sounds of varying pitch. Gradually all his senses returned to normal. Even his eyes under the blindfold ceased to report only glare blindness, and he saw those peculiar, dissolving grayish patterns that human eyes transmit from darkness. More squeakings. A long time later he moved over nearly level grassy ground. He was led for possibly half a mile. He had not tried to speak during all his descent. It would have been useless. If he was to be killed, he would be killed. But trouble had been taken to bring him down alive from a remaining bit of crumbling crater wall. His captors had evidently some use for him in mind. They abruptly held him still for a long time, perhaps as much as an hour. It seemed that either instructions were hard to come by, or some preparation was being made. Then the sound of something or someone approaching. Squeaks. He was led another long distance. Then claws or hands lifted him. Metal clanked. Those who held him dropped him. He fell 3 or 4 feet onto soft sand. There was a clanging of metal above his head. Then a human voice said sardonically, "Welcome to our city. Where'd they catch you?" Lockley said, "Up on a mountainside, trying to see what they were doing. Will you get me loose, please?" Hands worked on the cord that bound his arms close to his body. They loosened. He removed the blindfold. He was in a metal-walled and metal-ceilinged vault, perhaps 8 feet wide and the same in height, and perhaps 12 feet long. It had a floor of sand. Some small amount of light came in through the circular hole he'd been dropped through, despite a cover on it. There were 3 men already in confinement here. They wore clothing appropriate to workmen from the construction camp. There was a tall, lean man, and a broad man with a mustache, and a chunky man. The chunky man had spoken. "Did you see any of 'em?" he demanded now. Lockley shook his head. The 3 looked at each other and nodded. Lockley saw that they hadn't been in prison long. The sand floor was marked but not wholly formed into footprints, as it would have been had they moved restlessly about. Mostly, it appeared, they'd simply sat on the sand floor. "We didn't see 'em either," said the chunky man. "There was a hell of an explosion over at the lake this morning. We piled in a car, my car, and came over to see what had happened. Then something hit us, all of us. Lights, noise, a god-awful stink. A feeling all over like an electric shock that paralyzed us. We came to blindfolded and tied. They brought us here. That's our story so far. What's happened to you? And what really happened to us?" "I'm not sure," said Lockley. He hesitated. Then he told them about Vale and what he'd reported. They'd had no explanation at all of what had happened to them. They seemed relieved to be informed, though the information was hardly heartening. "Critters from Mars, eh?" said the mustached man. "I guess we'd act the same way if we was to get to Mars. They got to figure out some way to talk to who lives here. I guess that makes us it, unless we can figure out something better." Lockley, by temperament, tended to anticipate worse things in the future than had come in the past. The suggestion that the occupants of the spaceship had captured men to learn how to communicate with them seemed highly optimistic. He realized that he didn't believe it. It seemed extremely unlikely that the invaders from space were entirely ignorant of humanity. The choice of Boulder Lake as a landing place, for example, could not have been made from space. If there was need for deep water to land in, which seemed highly probable, then it would have been simple good sense to descend in the ocean. The ship could submerge, and then it could move about in the lake. Vail had said so. Such a ship would almost inevitably choose deep water in the ocean for a landing place. To land in a crater lake, one of possibly 2 or 3 on an entire continent suitable for their use, indicated that they had information in advance. Detailed information. It practically shouted of a knowledge of at least one human language by which information about Crater Lake could have been obtained. Whoever or whatever made use of the lake was no stranger to Earth. Yes, they needed a deep-water landing, and they knew that Boulder Lake would do. They probably knew very much more. But if they didn't know that Jill waited for him where the trail toward his ditched car began, then there was no reason to let them overhear the information. "I was part of a team making some baseline measurements," said Lockley, "when this business started. I began to check my instruments with a man named Vail." He told exactly, for the second time, what Vail said about the thing from the sky and the creatures who came out of it. Then he told of what he'd done. But he omitted all reference to Jill. His coming to the lake he ascribed to incredulity. Also, he did not mention meeting the fleeing population of the construction camp. When his story was finished, he sounded like a man who'd done a very foolhardy thing, but he didn't sound like a man with a girl on his mind. The broad man with the mustache asked a question or two. The tall man asked others. Lockley asked many. The answers were frustrating. They hadn't seen their captors at all. They'd heard squeaks when they were being brought to this place, and the squeaks were obviously language, but no human one. They had been bound as well as blindfolded. They hadn't been offered food since their capture, nor water. It seemed as if they'd been seized and put into this metal compartment to wait for some use of them by their captors. "Maybe they want to teach us to talk," said the mustached man. "Or maybe they're going to carve us up to see what makes us tick. Or maybe," he grimaced, "maybe they want to know if we're good to eat." The chunky man said, "Why'd they blindfold us?" Lockley had begun to have a very grim suspicion about this. It came out of the realization of how remarkable it was that a ship designed to be navigable in deep water should have landed in a deep crater lake. He said, "Vail said at first that they weren't human, though they were only specks in his binoculars. Later, when he saw them close, he didn't say what they looked like." "Must be pretty weird," said the tall man. "Maybe," said the man with the mustache, attempting humor. "Maybe they didn't want us to see them because we'd be scared. Or maybe they didn't want to blindfold us, but just to cover us up. Maybe they wouldn't mind us seeing them, but it hurts for them to look at us." Lockley said abruptly, "This box we're in, it's made by humans." The mustached man said quickly, "We figured that. It's the shell of a compost pit for the hotel that's going to be built around here. They'll sink it in the ground and dump garbage in it, and it'll rot, and then it'll be fertilizer. These critters from space are just using it to hold us. But what are they going to do with us?" There were faint squeakings. The cover to the ground opening lifted. 3 rabbits dropped down. The cover closed with a clang. The rabbits shivered and crouched, terrified, in one corner. "Is this how they're gonna feed us?" demanded the chunky man. "Hell no," said the tall man in evident disgust. "They're dumped in here like we were. They're animals, so are we. This is a temporary cage. It's got a sand floor that we can bury things in. It won't be any trouble to clean out. The rabbits and us, we stay caged until they're ready to do whatever